The voice coming over an American radio net did not always belong to an American. By 1969, that possibility was no longer something a radio operator could dismiss. Enemy stations had entered U.S. and South Vietnamese nets with imitation messages. Captured American radios were in communist hands, and field manuals were warning operators that if a transmission did not sound right, the problem might not be static, a bad handset, or some nervous new man on the net. It might be somebody listening to them from the other side. I want to be careful with the title before we go farther. I have not found a traceable patrol report that lets me tell you one American unit literally heard its own call sign spoken back from the jungle on one particular day. That scene gets the point across, but the record gives us something better. On December 20th, 1969, soldiers from the 1st Infantry Division found the people who had been listening, and when they opened the enemy logbooks, their own radio world was already in there. Call signs, units, locations, names, plans, conversations American operators had assumed were disappearing into the air as soon as they released the push-to-talk switch. They had not disappeared. Somebody had written them down. That morning, elements of the 2nd Battalion, 2nd Infantry, and the 2nd Battalion, 28th Infantry, both from the 1st Brigade, 1st Infantry Division, were operating a few kilometers north of Ben Suc. The country around there had been worked hard for years. Rubber plantation, villages, roads, jungle. American units had moved through it with radios everywhere. Company nets, battalion nets, artillery, aircraft, command traffic. A man on patrol could carry a PRC-25 or PRC-77 on his back and think of it as the line leading home. Headquarters was on the other end. Artillery was on the other end. A medevac request, a resupply problem, a grid correction, a change of direction. All of it passed through that handset. The radio was trust-made portable. That is what makes the discovery near Ben Suc so unsettling. A scout found a long wire antenna, not a dramatic object. A wire. It led toward a concealed underground position. Once American troops got into the site, they found an enemy radio intercept station. 12 communist soldiers were captured there. So was the equipment. There were American-made field radios, Chinese equipment, commercial Sony and Panasonic receivers that had been modified, homemade equipment, and there were documents. The radios explained how the enemy had listened. The documents explained what they had understood. That second part is the one that mattered. For years, many American commanders had treated enemy interception as a nuisance rather than a working intelligence system. There were warnings. The Army Security Agency and the National Security Agency had been telling commanders that communist forces were listening to tactical radio traffic. The response was uneven. Some people took communication security seriously, some did not. Call signs did not always change as often as they were supposed to. Frequencies did not always change. Locally invented code words could stay in use long enough for anybody listening regularly to work out what they meant. And radio operators were human. Men talked. Some were disciplined. Some were tired. Some had a lieutenant standing over them wanting an answer immediately. Some had been using the same net with the same people long enough that formal procedure started to feel like an obstacle between two men who already knew each other's voices. That is how routine creeps in. You hear the same operator every day. He says the same call sign. You recognize the cadence. You know who takes too long to answer. You know who clips the first word when he keys the handset. You know which commander talks too much. Those little habits make a net feel familiar. They can also make it easier to study. The Alpha 3 logbooks showed that somebody had been studying. The unit was part of the Communist 47th Tactical Reconnaissance Battalion. Its radio people were not sitting around trying to catch one lucky transmission. They were building files. American call signs appeared next to unit identifications. Transmissions were copied down. The enemy analysts worked out who was talking to whom and what the traffic meant. They tracked positions. They followed changes. They learned how American units talked when they were preparing to move. They learned what kinds of messages came before artillery missions, air support, casualty reports, and ambush positions. That does not mean every American patrol was walking into a trap every time somebody pressed a handset. It means the radio net was not private. That is a different statement, and it is enough. One of the details in the captured material is almost embarrassing in its simplicity. The communist analysts noticed that American units did not always change call signs and frequencies often enough. And when changes did happen, confused American operators sometimes helped the listeners figure out the new system by talking through the problem on the old net. No spy movie required. No stolen briefcase. A man loses contact. He wants to find his people. He starts asking questions. Somebody else answers. The network repairs itself in the open, and the man listening from a bunker writes down the new pattern. That is what contaminated information looks like in a real war. Not one magical enemy operator who knows everything. 100 small pieces. A call sign today. A location tomorrow. A unit nickname. A familiar voice. A report about casualties. An airstrike warning. A commander asking another commander where he wants a company before dark. Each transmission by itself may feel harmless. Put enough of them in one notebook, and you begin to see the unit. The Alpha 3 people were good enough at this, that their logs did not just record words. They analyzed them. One typical kind of entry identified a company commander talking to a battalion commander about an ambush location, and then connected that traffic to the U.S. unit operating in the area. That is the part I would have hated to find if I had been one of the radio operators whose traffic was in those notebooks. Not that the enemy heard me, that I had become predictable. Because once the other side knows what a call sign means, the sound of that call sign changes. It used to identify your people. Now it also tells you somebody else may know exactly who just keyed the radio. And once captured American radios were part of the enemy system, another problem came with it. They were not restricted to listening on some distant receiver built for intelligence work. A captured PRC-25 could sit inside the same frequency range as the radios U.S. infantry carried. The American Army's own communications history later acknowledged that Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces were using captured radios in that spectrum. False communications became enough of a problem that training material warned operators about enemy stations posing as friendly stations. That is where the title of this episode comes closest to the documented truth. Enemy operators did enter friendly nets. They did use deceptive imitation messages. They did exploit captured American equipment. The manuals say combat experience showed those false communications caused casualties and disrupted missions. What I cannot responsibly give you is the neat scene where one named patrol hears its own exact call sign, looks at the radio, and realizes the jungle is talking back. History is rarely kind enough to preserve the perfect scene. Instead, we have the system that made that scene possible. And we have the bunker that proved the system existed. For the radio operators watching, I want to ask something narrow here. When you had worked the same tactical net long enough to recognize the regular voices, what was usually the first thing that made a transmission feel wrong to you? The voice itself, the rhythm of the operator, wording that your unit would not normally use, or something else? I am not asking for procedures or codes. I am interested in recognition, the little human clue that made a man stop before answering. Because that human recognition sat beside a more formal system. Authentication existed for a reason. If a station gave an instruction that affected the tactical situation, or if an operator suspected somebody did not belong on the net, there were procedures for challenging the transmission. On paper, that sounds straightforward. In the field, paper procedures had to compete with urgency. A patrol in contact did not have the same patience as a classroom. A radio operator with somebody yelling beside him did not experience a table of authentication data the same way an instructor did. And some commanders believed complicated radio security slowed their own units more than it slowed the enemy. That belief had consequences. Before the 1st Cavalry Division deployed to Vietnam, Army Security Agency monitors found thousands of communications violations during training. Major General Harry Kinnard, the division commander, believed the enemy would not be able to turn intercepted traffic into useful action quickly enough. That confidence was common. American units moved fast. Helicopters moved faster. Plans changed. So the assumption was that even if the enemy heard something, he would always be behind. Alpha 3's notebooks showed why that assumption was dangerous. The enemy did not need to react to every sentence. He could build a pattern. If a unit used the same call signs long enough, the pattern stayed useful. If a commander spoke often enough, the listener learned who he was. If the same code word kept appearing before the same kind of event, the code stopped being much of a code. You do not have to understand everything today if you are still listening tomorrow. That is why the raid on December 20th mattered beyond one bunker. Until then, senior people could argue about how much the communists really understood. Afterward, the argument got much harder. The Americans had the enemy's equipment. They had the operators. They had the training material. And they had the notebooks. The notebooks were written in English. That detail landed hard. American commanders had sometimes doubted whether enemy intercept personnel could understand enough English to follow fast military voice traffic. The men in Alpha 3 were doing more than following it. They were interpreting it. They were connecting one conversation to another. The discovery also changed the way some earlier events looked. Take Ia Drang in 1965. American radio traffic there had been enormous. The fighting around Landing Zone X-ray depended on constant communication between ground units, helicopters, artillery, and command posts. Later communications histories noted that North Vietnamese forces in the area had their own intercept capability and could learn from American traffic. Again, you have to be disciplined here. It would be easy to turn that into a claim that every enemy movement at Ia Drang came from radio intelligence. The record does not let us do that. What it does tell us is that Americans were broadcasting far more of their situation than many of them understood at the time. By December 1969, the Alpha 3 capture showed the problem in physical form. There is something almost ordinary about the equipment list. American field radios, a Chinese receiver, commercial radios, homemade gear, flashlight batteries adapted to keep equipment operating, a long wire antenna. Nothing about it looks like the kind of intelligence system Americans wanted to believe could threaten a modern army. That may be why it worked so well. The enemy did not need a more impressive radio than the American patrol. He only needed to hear the American patrol. There is another small detail I like, because it tells you how patient the work was. The intercept operators profiled units. They learned the transportation American formations used. They followed movement patterns. They were interested in commanders and artillery observers and forward air controllers because certain voices carried more valuable information than others. In other words, they did what anybody listening professionally would do. They learned whose words mattered. That means a call sign was not just a label. Once the listener connected it to a job, it had value. A battalion commander's call sign meant one thing. A company commander meant another. An artillery observer meant something else. The enemy did not have to know the man's real name to know that a particular voice could move soldiers or bring fire onto a grid. And now put yourself back with an American RTO after the discovery. The radio feels different. You still need it. That is the uncomfortable part. Nobody can solve the problem by saying, "Fine, turn the radios off." A patrol without communications can create an even worse problem. The unit still needs contact. The commander still needs reports. The men still need support. So the answer is, discipline inside a system you know somebody is trying to penetrate. That is a harder kind of trust. Not trusting that nobody is listening. Trusting your people enough to communicate while behaving as though somebody is. The introduction of secure voice equipment helped. Fixed headquarters had secure systems earlier. Later, man-carried secure voice equipment reached combat units. But even then, weight and inconvenience mattered. The communications history records a problem veterans will recognize immediately. Security equipment does not help much if the man carrying it decides the extra load is too much and leaves it behind. The combined radio and secure equipment could become a heavy burden before you added a weapon, batteries, water, and everything else an RTO already had. So the perfect technical answer and the practical infantry answer were not always the same. That tension never really went away during the war. And it is one reason I think this episode works better as a document story than as a dramatic fake radio story. The dramatic version gives you one bad voice. The Alpha 3 files give you years of listening. The dramatic version gives you one patrol that suddenly realizes the enemy knows its call sign. The captured notebooks show that multiple American units had been giving the enemy enough information to build profiles. The 47th Tactical Reconnaissance Battalion focused on major formations, including the 1st Infantry Division, the 25th Infantry Division, the 1st Cavalry Division, and the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment. These were not obscure outfits, making one careless mistake. They were large American formations living on radio traffic. The intercept problem was built into the way the war was being fought. That is why the final moment of this story is not a transmission. It is a notebook. An American soldier finds an antenna. The antenna leads to a bunker. The bunker leads to radios. The radios lead to captured operators. And the operators lead to pages covered with American voices. Somewhere in those pages was the thing the United States had been slow to accept. The jungle did not need to answer the call sign. It already knew what the call sign meant. After December 20th, 1969, that was no longer a theory. The 1st Infantry Division had the logbooks in its hands.